Picture a misty morning in October, the year 1066, as two armies faced each other across the field of Hastings. The fate of England and the entire medieval world hung in the balance. With a single, decisive charge, William the Conqueror shattered the old order, claiming the English crown and reshaping history forever. This wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point, a moment where the course of kingdoms shifted in a single day. And Hastings is just one of the countless moments where ambition, strategy, and sheer willpower redrew the map of Europe. What if William had faltered? What if Charlemagne had never been crowned emperor? Or if the Vikings had never set sail? The medieval world was built on these pivotal instant coronations that ignited empires, battles that toppled dynasties, and cultural revolutions that echoed for centuries. These weren't just events, they were the sparks that lit the fires of modern Europe. Behind every castle, every law, every tradition we recognize today, there's a story of power, betrayal, or brilliance waiting to be uncovered. That's why we're embarking on this journey through 30 unforgettable moments that defined the rise of medieval kingdoms. From the crowning of kings to the clash of armies, from the birth of new ideas to the collapse of old regimes, each moment is a thread in the grand tapestry of history. Together, we'll explore how these decisive instants shaped nations, forged identities, and left legacies that still influence our world. So ready yourself, because history isn't just about dates and names. It's about the choices that changed everything, and what you're about to witness are the moments that made the medieval world unforgettable. The mighty Roman Empire, once the unshakable pillar of order and civilization, crumbled in the year 476 when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic leader Odoacer. Historian Edward Gibbon famously called this moment the greatest, perhaps, and most awful scene in the history of mankind. Not just an ending, but a dramatic rebirth. With Rome's collapse, the Mediterranean world fractured into chaos. Roads fell into disrepair, cities emptied, and the centralized power that had governed for centuries dissolved like sand through open fingers. But nature abhors a vacuum, and into that void stepped ambitious new rulers, chieftains, and warlords who would reshape Europe forever. The Germanic tribes, long seen as barbarians at the gates, became the architects of a new age. The Visigoths carved out a kingdom in Spain, the Ostrogoths ruled Italy, and most crucially, the Franks rose to power in Gaul under leaders like Clovis, whose conversion to Christianity wove faith into the fabric of kingship. These weren't mere conquerors, they were adapters, blending Roman traditions with their own warrior codes to forge something entirely new. Local strongmen filled the gaps left by vanished imperial administrators, offering protection in exchange for loyalty, a system that would evolve into the feudal bonds defining medieval society. What emerged from Rome's shadow wasn't just disorder, but opportunity. Without a single empire dictating laws, cultures diversified, languages branched, and regional identities took root. The old Roman ideal of universal citizenship gave way to a patchwork of loyalties to a lord, a tribe, a village. And yet, amidst this fragmentation, echoes of Rome endured. Latin remained the language of learning, its roads still carried travelers, and its dream of unity would inspire rulers like Charlemagne centuries later. The fall wasn't an end, but a fiery crucible one that forged the medieval world's first kingdoms from the ashes of empire. The crisp waters of the baptismal font shimmered in the candlelight as Clovis, king of the Franks, knelt before the Bishop of Rheims on that fateful Christmas day in 496. With this single act, the first baptism of a barbarian king into Catholic Christianity, The course of European history tilted. Gone were the old pagan gods of his ancestors. In their place stood the cross, a symbol not just of faith, but of political genius. Clovis understood what many warlords did not. Uniting his people under one religion could weave his fractured realm into something far stronger. His conversion wasn't merely spiritual, it was strategic. By embracing Catholicism, Clovis gained the support of the powerful Gallo-Roman bishops, whose influence stretched across towns and villages. Where his armies couldn't reach, the church's networks could, binding his kingdom together with the glue of shared belief. And when he defeated the rival Arian Visigoths at the Battle of Vouillé in 507, it wasn't just a military victory, it was a holy war sanctified by the Pope himself. For the first time, a barbarian king stood not as an outsider, but as God's chosen ruler. Yet Clovis's legacy wasn't built on battles alone. His Lex Salica, a legal code written in Latin but steeped in Frankish tradition, became the bedrock of medieval law. Unlike Rome's complex statutes, these rules were blunt and practical. Theft repaid in cattle, insults settled with gold, and land inherited only through male lines, a clause that would later shape dynastic wars for centuries. It was a fusion of old and new, just like his kingdom. By the time of his death in 511, Clovis had transformed the Franks from a scattering of warring clans into Europe's most formidable kingdom. His heirs would squander much of it, but the blueprint remained, a realm where crown and cross were inseparable. And in the shadows of that blueprint, greater dynasties like the Carolingians would one day rise, dreaming of an empire to rival Rome itself. The snow had barely melted from Rome's cobbled streets when Charlemagne, king of the Franks, knelt in prayer before St. Peter's altar on Christmas Day in the year 800. What happened next would echo through history. Pope Leo Roman III placed a golden crown upon the warrior king's head, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. The basilica erupted with cheers, but the real shockwave was political. For the first time in over 3 centuries, Europe had an emperor, and the church had handpicked him. This wasn't just a coronation, it was a masterstroke of theater. Leo, still recovering from an assassination attempt by Roman nobles, needed a protector. Charlemagne, fresh from crushing rebellions and baptizing pagans at sword point, craved legitimacy beyond brute force. Together, they staged a revival of Rome's glory, but with a twist. This empire would be Christian first, Roman second. The crown itself was thick with meaning. By crowning Charlemagne, Leo didn't just honor a king, he claimed the right to make emperors, binding secular power to papal approval. It was a gamble that would define church-state relations for centuries. Charlemagne, ever the pragmatist, played along. He knew the title gave him authority over newly conquered lands like Saxony and Bavaria, where local dukes bristled under Frankish rule. Now, he wasn't just their conqueror, he was God's anointed. His court scholars even revived Latin titles like Augustus, stitching his reign to Rome's legacy, while his scribes penned lofty proclamations of a new Athens, an empire where faith and learning flourished. But Charlemagne's genius lay in more than symbolism. He reshaped governance with missi dominicii, royal envoys who galloped across his realms to enforce laws and root out corruption. He mandated churches double as schools, preserving ancient texts and teaching priests to read, an early spark of the Carolingian Renaissance. Even his handwriting reform, the clear, rounded Carolingian minuscule, became the ancestor of modern typefaces. Yet for all his vision, the empire's glue was personal loyalty. When he died in 814, the machinery of state crumbled under squabbling heirs. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 carved his domain into 3 shaky kingdoms, a patchwork that would become France, Germany, and the battleground between them. The irony: Charlemagne's crowning aimed to unify Europe, but its true legacy was the tension it unleashed between popes and emperors, between fractured kingdoms dreaming of lost unity. The Holy Roman Empire he inspired would chase his ghost for 1,000 years, a realm forever balancing on the knife's edge of faith and power. Dawn broke over the monastery of Lindisfarne in the year 793, but no prayers rose to greet it, only screams. The first Viking longships had come like a storm from the sea, their dragon-prowed hulls slicing through the morning mist. Monks who had spent lifetimes copying scripture now watched in horror as axes splintered their sacred doors. Gold crosses were ripped from altars, holy books burned for warmth, and those not slaughtered were dragged away in chains. News of the attack raced across Europe like wildfire, carrying a single chilling message: nowhere was safe. For the next 2 centuries, Viking raids became the nightmare of Christendom. These weren't just pirates, they were opportunists, exploiting Europe's fractured kingdoms with surgical precision. Their longships, shallow enough to navigate rivers yet sturdy enough to cross oceans, turned waterways into highways of havoc. Paris was sacked in 845, its streets choked with smoke as warriors demanded silver to spare the city. Coastal villages from Ireland to Italy fortified their churches with makeshift watchtowers, while rumors spread of Norse berserkers who fought in a trance-like fury. Yet the Vikings' true weapon wasn't brute force, it was unpredictability. A farmer might plant crops in spring only to find his fields trampled by autumn, his family taken as thralls, his world erased in a single moonlit raid. But terror wasn't their only legacy. In England, the great heathen army of the 860s didn't just conquer, they settled. The Danelaw, a vast swath of northern and eastern England, became a melting pot where Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions collided. Viking place names still dot the map today. Derby, Whitby, even the word law itself traces back to Old Norse. Their legal assemblies, called things, laid groundwork for local governance, while their trade networks stretched from Constantinople's silk markets to the walrus ivory stalls of Greenland. Amidst this chaos, one king refused to surrender. Alfred of Wessex, cornered in the swamps of Athelney in 878, turned disaster into destiny. While other rulers paid dangled tribute to buy temporary peace, Alfred rebuilt. He fortified towns with burhs, a chain of strongholds spaced a day's march apart. He reformed the Fyrd, creating a rotating army that could respond faster than Viking raiders. Most crucially, he bet on education, translating Latin texts into Old English and declaring that a king's duty is to rule with wisdom, not just a sword. His victories at Eddington and London didn't just save Wessex, they forged the idea of a united England. The Vikings didn't vanish, they evolved. Rollo, a raider so fearsome even his own men struggled to control him, became Duke of Normandy in 911, trading his pagan name for a Christian crown. His descendants would one day conquer England under William the Bastard, proving that the axe and the cross could build as much as they destroyed. What began with smoke over Lindisfarne ended with kingdoms remade, not just by violence but by the relentless pressure of change. The marshes of Athelney swallowed Alfred whole in the spring of 878, his kingdom reduced to a soggy hideout, his people scattered, his hopes clinging to the reeds like morning fog. The Viking Great Heathen Army held Wessex in its grip, their leader Guthrum savoring what seemed like certain victory. But history has a way of turning desperation into legend. Alfred wasn't just hiding, he was planning. From those waterlogged ruins, he orchestrated a comeback that would echo through the ages, beginning with the thunderous clash at Eddington. When Alfred's forces finally cornered Guthrum's army near the chalk hills of Wiltshire, it wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in strategy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our window into this pivotal moment, describes how Alfred fought against the entire Viking host, put them to flight, and pursued them as far as their fortress. For 14 grueling days, he besieged Guthrum's camp until the Viking warlord, starving and broken, surrendered on one extraordinary condition: baptism. In a ceremony dripping with symbolism, Guthrum knelt before Alfred, taking the Christian name Athelstan. It was more than a religious conversion, it was a political spectacle. By forcing Guthrum to acknowledge the God of the English, Alfred didn't just win a battle, he rewrote the rules of conquest, but Eddington was only the start. Alfred knew that beating the Vikings required more than battlefield brilliance. It demanded systemic change. His military reforms were revolutionary. He divided the feared, the traditional peasant army, into rotating shifts so farms weren't left defenseless during planting season. He built a network of fortified towns spaced precisely a day's march apart, creating a defensive web that choked off Viking mobility. Each burh had walls high enough to deter attackers and a garrison trained to sound the alarm at the first sign of longships. These weren't just strongholds, they were the skeleton of a nation in waiting, a blueprint for centralized defense that future kings would inherit. Yet Alfred's true genius lay in understanding that swords alone couldn't secure a kingdom. In an age when even nobles often scratched marks instead of writing names, he launched an educational renaissance. The saddest thing about any people, he once lamented, is when they have no knowledge. He recruited scholars from across Europe, translating Latin texts into Old English, including Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, which he distributed to bishops like a medieval bestseller. His court became a workshop of ideas, where scribes copied manuscripts and charters flowed with unprecedented detail. Even his law code, blending Mosaic principles with Saxon pragmatism, emphasized mercy over vengeance, declaring that a judge must know the difference between recklessness and misfortune. The ripple effects of Alfred's reign were monumental. By the time of his death in 899, the map of England had begun to harden around Wessex's influence. His successors, building on his reforms, would eventually knit together the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a single realm, no longer just Wessex, Mercia, or Northumbria, but England. And though Viking raids would flare up again, the days of unchecked terror were over. Alfred had proven that a kingdom could outthink its invaders, that literacy could be as potent as a levy, and that leadership, when rooted in vision rather than vanity, could turn the tide of history. His legacy wasn't just in the land he saved, but in the idea he ignited, that England was worth defending, not as a collection of tribes, but as a destiny. The wind howled across Senlac Hill on October 14, 1066, whipping the banners of two armies destined to rewrite history. On one side stood Harold Godwinson, England's newly crowned king, his Saxon housecarls gripping their massive two-handed axes. Across the field, William of Normandy's knights shifted impatiently in their saddles, their chainmail glinting under a leaden sky. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a collision of worlds. William's cavalry charged uphill, only to be repelled by the Saxon shield wall, a living fortress of interlocked wood and iron. Then came the fateful moment. A rumor swept the Norman lines that William had fallen. Panic threatened to unravel his army until the Duke himself ripped off his helmet, bellowing, "Look at me, I live, and by God's help I will conquer." The tide turned when Harold's men, lured into breaking formation by a feigned retreat, were cut down by Norman horsemen. By dusk, Harold lay dead, an arrow piercing his eye, and England's throne belonged to a foreigner. William's victory at Hastings was just the beginning. To cement his rule, he launched a project so thorough it stunned even his allies, the Domesday Book. Commissioned in 1086, this wasn't merely a tax ledger, it was a weapon of control. Royal clerks fanned out across England, interrogating villagers under oath, cataloguing every ox, acre, and mill. No detail escaped scrutiny. One entry even notes a Hampshire farmer who could not be taxed because the wolves ate his sheep. The message was clear: resistance was futile. The Domesday book gave William an iron grip on his new realm, exposing who owned what, who owed what, and where rebellions might brew. For the first time since the Romans, England was mapped, measured, and mastered on parchment. But Norman ambition didn't stop at paperwork. They reshaped England's very fabric. Old English, the tongue of Beowulf, was banished from courts, replaced by Norman French, a linguistic upheaval that birthed modern English's hybrid vocabulary, where beef comes from the French boef while cow remains Germanic. Law codes fused Saxon customs with Norman rigor, creating a system where trial by jury gradually replaced trial by ordeal. And then there were the castles. Towering stone keeps like the White Tower of London weren't just fortresses. They were psychological warfare, symbols of alien power looming over conquered towns. Even churches transformed, as squat Saxon chapels gave way to soaring Norman cathedrals, their rounded arches proclaiming a new divine order. The conquest's ripple effects reached far beyond England's shores. William's success proved feudal lords could transplant their power across seas, inspiring later ventures like the Crusades. Yet his reign also sowed seeds of future conflict between Norman kings and their barons, between French-speaking elites and Anglo-Saxon commoners, between the idea of a unified England and the reality of a patchwork realm. The Bayeux Tapestry, stitched soon after Hastings, captures this duality. It's a Norman version of history, yet its final panel shows Saxon soldiers fleeing under the Latin phrase, et fuga verterunt Angli, and the English turned to flight. 1,000 years later, the echoes of that day still resonate in our laws, our language, and the very stones of England's oldest towers. The snows of Canossa bit deep into Henry IV's bare feet as he knelt outside the castle gates in January 1077, his royal robes swapped for sackcloth, his breath hanging in the frigid air like a ghost of his former pride. For 3 days, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful secular ruler in Christendom, waited as Pope Gregory VII deliberated inside, weighing whether to absolve the man who had dared to defy him. This wasn't just penance, it was theater of the highest stakes, a showdown that would redefine the balance of power in medieval Europe. The roots of this clash stretched back to the very nature of authority. For centuries, kings and emperors had treated bishoprics as political prizes, handing out croziers like swords to loyal nobles. Bishops were governors as much as clergymen, controlling vast lands and levying taxes. But Gregory, a fiery reformer elected pope in 1073, saw this as corruption. His Dictatus Papae, a bold manifesto, declared that only the pope could appoint or depose bishops, that kings had no right to invest them with spiritual authority, and that the papacy could even overthrow emperors. To Henry, this was anarchy. If bishops answered only to Rome, his empire would fracture into a patchwork of independent church-states. The crisis exploded when Henry appointed his own Archbishop of Milan, flouting Gregory's reforms. The Pope responded with the medieval equivalent of a nuclear option, excommunication. Suddenly, Henry's vassals were released from their oaths of allegiance, and rebellion simmered across Germany. Facing revolt, Henry made his desperate winter trek to Canossa, gambling that humiliation before the Pope would save his throne. Gregory, knowing the emperor's submission would cement papal supremacy, let him wait a calculated delay that turned the castle steps into a stage for the world to witness. When the gates finally creaked open, Henry's barefoot plea became the ultimate symbol of spiritual power triumphing over temporal might. yet Canossa was less an ending than a detonator. The Investiture Controversy raged for another 40 years, its resolution the Concordat of Worms in 1122 splitting the difference. Emperors retained some influence over appointments, but bishops now derived their spiritual authority solely from Rome. The real victory was ideological. Gregory's stand established that even emperors were answerable to the Church, a principle that would embolden future popes to excommunicate kings, launch crusades, and wield moral authority like a crown. Meanwhile, Henry's ordeal exposed the fragility of imperial power, setting a precedent that German princes would exploit to weaken their monarchs for centuries. The echoes of this clash reverberated far beyond theology. The very idea of separate spheres, church and state, began here in the snows of Canossa. Gregory's vision of a papal monarchy would reach its zenith under Innocent III, while Henry's descendants would grapple with the paradox of ruling an empire where spiritual loyalty lay elsewhere. In an age where faith and governance were inseparable, the Investiture Controversy didn't just redefine power, it revealed the fault lines that would shape Europe's political landscape for generations. The summer sun blazed over Jerusalem's limestone walls in July 1099, baking the blood-stained stones as Crusader forces, gaunt from 3 years of marching and fighting, finally breached the holy city. Eyewitness chronicles like the Gesta Francorum describe scenes of delirium and horror, knights weeping at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, then turning to slaughter Muslim and Jewish civilians in streets slick with gore. The carnage was so great, wrote Raymond of Aguilers, that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. This wasn't just conquest, it was an explosion of pent-up zeal, vengeance, and desperation. These warriors had crossed continents, survived starvation and betrayal, believing victory would absolve their sins. Now, amidst the chaos, they carved out a new chapter in Holy War's grim history. The road to Jerusalem had been paved with contradictions. Pope Urban II's call to arms at Clermont in 1095 promised spiritual rewards, but the Crusaders' motives were anything but pure. Some sought land, like Bohemond of Taranto, who eyed Antioch as his personal kingdom. Others, like the charismatic preacher Peter the Hermit, led untrained mobs that pillaged Christian villages en route. Even the campaign's timing was strategic. Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos had begged for mercenaries to reclaim Anatolia, never expecting an avalanche of armed pilgrims. When the Crusades' disorganized waves reached Constantinople, Alexios hurriedly ferried them across the Bosphorus, hoping they'd serve as a buffer against the Seljuks. What unfolded next defied all expectations. Against staggering odds, the Crusaders took Nicaea, Antioch, and finally Jerusalem itself, less through divine intervention than ruthless pragmatism. At Antioch, they stumbled upon the Holy Lance, a spearhead supposedly from Christ's crucifixion, reinvigorating morale just as supplies ran out. Outside Jerusalem, they constructed siege towers from dismantled Italian ships, exploiting the Fatimid defenders' weak northern flank. Yet their greatest weapon was psychological, the certainty that death in battle meant martyrdom. The fallout reshaped the Mediterranean chessboard. 4 Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, County of Tripoli, Principality of Antioch, and County of Edessa sprang up like fragile outposts in a Muslim sea. Their survival depended on a precarious balance, importing European knights while taxing local Muslim and Christian peasants, building castles like crack des Chevaliers that blended European might with Eastern design, and navigating shifting alliances. One moment, Crusader queens like Melisende of Jerusalem patronized Arabic-speaking scholars. The next, Templar knights executed prisoners in the shadow of the Dome of the Rock. The Crusades' legacy wasn't just territorial. It birthed military orders like the Templars, monks who became bankers and warriors, and sparked a surge in Mediterranean trade that would later fuel the Renaissance. But it also poisoned interfaith relations for centuries, embedding the idea of holy war into Europe's DNA. When Saladin reclaimed Jerusalem in 1187, it wasn't the end of an era, just the opening move in a clash of worlds that still echoes today. The Baltic wind carried more than salt and seaweed through the bustling port of Lübeck in the 12th century. It carried the clink of silver coins, the shouts of merchants haggling in a dozen languages, and the creak of ships heavy with Flemish wool, Russian furs, and Scandinavian timber. This wasn't just trade, it was the birth of an economic revolution. Out of this chaos emerged the Hanseatic League, a network of merchant guilds and cities that transformed Northern Europe's commerce into a tightly knit empire of profit and influence. Unlike the feudal lords who ruled by sword and decree, the Hanse's power flowed through ledgers, harbor fees, and the shared language of profit. At its peak, the League stretched from Novgorod's icy markets to London's smoky wharfs, with Lübeck as its beating heart. What made the Hanse extraordinary wasn't just its scale, it was its innovations. Merchants pooled resources to fund voyages, creating early versions of joint stock companies. They established contours, fortified trading posts where goods could be stored safely, and disputes settled under Hanseatic law, bypassing local rulers. Credit notes replaced bulky coin shipments, a precursor to modern banking. Even piracy was countered with collective action. Cities like Hamburg and Bremen financed armed convoys to protect their fleets, a medieval version of insurance. But the League's true genius lay in its flexibility. There was no Hanseatic king or capital, just a loose alliance of cities that met irregularly in diets to negotiate tariffs and treaties. Decisions were enforced not by armies but by economic sanctions. When Bruges once dared to tax Hanseatic goods too heavily, the merchants simply packed up and relocated to nearby Antwerp for a decade, crushing Bruges' economy until it begged for terms. This was power wielded not through crowns but through supply chains. Yet all empires have their twilight. As the 15th century dawned, the rise of centralized nation-states like England and Sweden chipped away at the Hanse's dominance. Monarchs hungry for control granted trading privileges to their own merchants, sidelining the League's middlemen. The Dutch, with their sleeker ships and direct routes to the East Indies, outmaneuvered Hanseatic monopolies. Even nature turned against them. The shifting sandbars of the Baltic choked off once busy harbors, while the Little Ice Age froze trade routes solid for months. By the time the 30 Years' War ravaged Northern Europe in the 17th century, the Hanse was a ghost of its former self. The last official diet met in 1669, a mere formality. But its legacy lingered in the cobblestone streets of Tallinn's Old Town, in the red brick Gothic warehouses of Gdansk, and most of all, in the idea that commerce could bind distant cities tighter than any crown. The Hanseatic League didn't just trade goods, it traded ideas, proving that even in an age of knights and castles, the real power often lay in the hands of those who knew the value of a well-balanced ledger. The reeds along the Thames whispered in the June breeze as King John, the most despised monarch in English memory, dismounted at Runnymede in 1215. Surrounded by barons whose swords outnumbered his loyalists 3-1, he dipped his quill into ink that might as well have been his own pride. The document he signed, Magna Carta, the Great Charter, wasn't born of idealism but exhaustion. After years of extortionate taxes, failed wars, and the humiliation of losing Normandy, England's nobility had reached their breaking point. Yet what began as a bargaining chip between a weak king and his angry vassals would become the cornerstone of constitutional government. The Charter's 63 clauses read like a laundry list of grievances, but their implications were revolutionary. Clause 12 declared that no scutage or aid shall be imposed without common consent of the kingdom, effectively inventing the principle of taxation by representation. Clause 39 promised that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by lawful judgment of his peers, planting the seed for due process. Most radical of all was Clause 61, establishing a council of 25 barons with the power to overrule the king if he violated their rights. For the first time in medieval Europe, a monarch's will was bound by written law. Historians still debate its immediate impact. John repudiated the Charter within weeks, plunging England into civil war, but its symbolic power proved indestructible. As David Carpenter notes in his definitive study, Magna Carta was a failure in 1215 but a triumph in posterity. Reissued under Henry III and Edward I, it became a weapon for reformers across centuries. Parliamentarians brandished it against Charles I in the 1640s. American colonists quoted it while protesting British taxes. Even the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights traces its lineage to Runymed's Meadows. Yet Magna Carta's genius lay in its flexibility. Unlike rigid legal codes, its vague phrasing, "To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice," allowed reinterpretation for changing times. When Edward Coke resurrected it in the 1600s to challenge royal absolutism, he wasn't reviving dusty parchment, he was unlocking its latent potential. Today, 4 original copies survive, 2 in the British Library, 1 in Salisbury Cathedral, another at Lincoln Castle, each a testament to the idea that power, no matter how absolute, must answer to something greater. The Charter's legacy isn't just in courts or constitutions, but in the quiet understanding it embedded across cultures. That authority exists to serve, not to rule. From Runymed's pressured compromise sprang a tradition that would inspire revolutions, shape nations, and remind even kings that no one stands above the law. The Alhambra's crimson towers stood silent on January 2, 1492, as Boabdil, the last Muslim ruler of Granada, handed its keys to Ferdinand and Isabella. The act was deceptively simple, a transfer of power between monarchs, but its echoes would reshape the world. After nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule in Spain, the Reconquista was complete. Yet this wasn't just a military victory. It was the climax of a slow, grinding cultural collision that had forged a uniquely Iberian identity. The terms of surrender seemed generous. Boabdil was granted a mountain estate, his subjects allowed to keep their faith, but within years, the cracks in those promises would widen into chasms. What made Ferdinand and Isabella's triumph possible was more than battlefield prowess. Their marriage in 1469 had united Aragon and Castile, blending her meticulous administration with his diplomatic cunning. Together, they waged war with relentless efficiency, funding campaigns through a new invention, the Santa Hermandad, a national police force that doubled as a revenue stream by fining lawbreakers. Their siege of Granada, which dragged on for 10 grueling years, became a testing ground for Renaissance warfare, Swiss mercenaries wielding pikes alongside Spanish arquebusiers, while Italian engineers designed siege engines to breach the Nasrid's legendary walls. Granada's fall didn't just end Muslim rule, it exposed the paradox of medieval Spain. For centuries, conviventure, the coexistence of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, had produced a golden age of scholarship. Arabic numerals, Aristotle's lost works, and breakthroughs in astronomy and medicine had flowed through cities like Toledo and Cordoba. Now, Isabella's confessor, the firebrand Cardinal Cisneros, saw a different destiny. He ordered the burning of thousands of Arabic manuscripts in Granada's plaza, sparing only medical texts. The Alhambra's intricate calligraphy praising Allah was plastered over with Christian frescoes. And in a move that would ripple across continents, the monarchs issued the Alhambra decree just months later, expelling all Jews who refused conversion, a decision that scattered Sephardic communities from Istanbul to Amsterdam. Yet even as doors slammed shut in Spain, others swung open. The same year Granada fell, a Genoese navigator named Columbus stood in the royal court, pleading for ships to sail west. With the Reconquista over, Isabella could redirect her attention and her treasury toward new frontiers. The gold that once funded siege engines now bought caravels, launching an age of exploration that would tether the fate of Europe to distant shores. Granada's surrender wasn't an ending, but a hinge, a moment where the medieval world pivoted toward something both dazzling and terrifying. The swords that had clashed for faith would soon cross oceans, carrying with them all the fervor and contradictions of a kingdom that had learned to conquer, but was still learning what it meant to rule. The first ships docked at Messina in October 1347, their crews already dying with grotesque black swellings oozing pus and blood. Within months, the pestilence christened the Black Death raced through Europe like a wildfire, sparing neither king nor peasant. Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed Florence's devastation firsthand, captured the horror in the Decameron. Fathers abandoned sons, wives deserted husbands, and corpses rotted in the streets until the stench was unbearable. By the time the plague receded in 1351, it had erased nearly half of Europe's population, some 25 million souls. But this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a tectonic shift that cracked open the foundations of medieval society. With entire villages wiped out and fields lying fallow, the survivors found themselves in an unimaginable position. Leverage. Peasants who once toiled under backbreaking labor demands now realized their worth. A farmhand who might have earned 3 pence a day before the plague could suddenly demand 6, or walk away to better-paying lords. The old feudal order, built on the assumption that labor was cheap and replaceable, began to crumble. In England, the Statute of Labourers in 1351 tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, sparking resentment that would boil over a generation later. France's Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 saw enraged peasants torch noble estates and slaughter landowners, screaming, "Death to all who drink wine while we thirst for water." Though brutally suppressed, these uprisings were warning shots, proof that the powerless had learned their power. Yet the plague's aftershocks weren't just about rebellion. The sheer scale of death forced innovation. Landowners, desperate to keep fields productive, began enclosing pastures for more efficient sheep farming, fueling the wool trade that would enrich merchants from Flanders to Florence. Monasteries stripped of monks sold lands to wealthy townsmen, accelerating the rise of a literate middle class. Even art transformed as morbid dance, macabre frescoes reminded viewers that death came for all, from pope to plowman. Amidst the chaos, resilience flickered. Towns like Orvieto in Italy pioneered quarantine laws, isolating sick travelers for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, the origin of our word quarantine. Medical schools, though still clinging to humoral theory, began dissecting corpses to study anatomy. And in the emptied spaces left by the dead, survivors planted new seeds, both literal and metaphorical, for a world that would, in time, grow into something unrecognizable to their grandparents. The Black Death didn't just kill, it cleared the ground for the Renaissance. The mud of the Loire Valley clung to Joan of Arc's armor as she rode toward Orleans in April 1429, her banner snapping in the spring wind. Just 17 years old, a peasant girl who'd never held a sword, she now led an army of hardened soldiers, all because she claimed to hear the voices of saints. The English, who had besieged the city for 6 months, scoffed at the Maid of Lorraine, but within 9 days, Joan would shatter their confidence and rewrite the course of the 100 Years' War. Orleans wasn't just a city, it was the linchpin of France's survival. English forces controlled much of the north, and their cannons had reduced Orleans' walls to rubble. The French Dauphin, Charles VII, was paralyzed with indecision, his treasury empty, his nobles squabbling. Then came Joan, insisting God had chosen her to save France. Skeptical commanders tested her, but when she correctly predicted a military reversal at the Battle of the Herrings, even hardened knights took notice. Her faith was contagious. She banned profanity from camp, ordered priests to hear soldiers' confessions, and convinced starving townsfolk that heaven itself would deliver them. The assault began on May 4th. Joan, clad in white armor, led charges through a hail of arrows, her presence electrifying the troops. Chroniclers describe her seizing a ladder at the Tourelles fortress, scaling it under fire as a crossbow bolt tore through her shoulder. Pulled from the fray, she yanked out the bolt herself and returned to battle, a moment immortalized in countless paintings. By May 8th, the English retreated in disarray, leaving behind their siege engines and wounded. Orleans was free, and Joan became a living legend, but her victories unnerved as much as they inspired. When she urged Charles to march straight to Rheims for his coronation, bypassing safer routes, courtiers whispered she was reckless or worse, a heretic. Yet the gamble paid off. On July 17th, Charles was crowned in Rheims Cathedral, Joan standing beside him with her banner. For a fleeting moment, France had its king, its hope, and its miracle. The downfall came swiftly. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English in 1430, Joan faced a rigged trial designed to discredit her divine mission. Her judges, many of them French clerics loyal to England, twisted her words. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was a theological trap claiming certainty of grace was heresy. Yet her answer was both humble and unshakable. Condemned for wearing men's clothes and false visions, she was burned at the stake in Rouen on May 30th, 1431. Yet Joan's legacy outlived the flames. Her triumphs at Orleans and Patay revitalized French resistance, proving the English could be beaten. By 1453, the 100 Years' War ended with England retaining only Calais, a far cry from its earlier dominance. In death, Joan became a symbol of national unity, canonized in 1920 and claimed by Republicans, monarchists, and feminists alike. Her story reminds us that history sometimes turns on the courage of the improbable, a teenage girl who changed a war, not with a general's tactics, but with the unyielding certainty that she was called. The quiet whir of the printing press in Mainz around 1450 might have sounded insignificant, just another craftsman's workshop in a bustling German town. But Johannes Gutenberg's invention wasn't just tinkering, it was a detonation waiting to happen. By replacing painstakingly handwritten manuscripts with movable metal type, he unlocked something explosive: mass production of knowledge. A single press could churn out hundreds of identical pages in a day, each one cheaper than a scribe's week of labor. Suddenly, books weren't just treasures locked in monastery libraries. They were commodities, slipping into merchant stalls and noble homes, carrying ideas faster and farther than ever before. The church, long the gatekeeper of literacy, found its monopoly crumbling. Where once a Bible took a year to copy and cost as much as a farm, Gutenberg's printed editions flooded Europe by the thousands, their crisp black letters inviting even modest townsfolk to read scripture for themselves. And with reading came questioning. Why did priests demand payment for indulgences when the text mentioned no such thing? Why were Latin services so mysterious if the apostles had preached in everyday tongues? The press didn't just distribute words, it distributed doubt, and with it, the seeds of rebellion. Martin Luther grasped this power instinctively. When he nailed his 95 Theses to Wittenberg's church door in 1517, it wasn't the act itself that shook Europe, it was the printed pamphlets that followed, racing across Germany like sparks in dry grass. Luther's tracts, written in punchy German instead of stuffy Latin, were tailor-made for the press. Printers couldn't keep up with demand. One in Strasbourg sold 300 copies in 2 days. By 1520, over 500,000 Reformation pamphlets circulated, a viral campaign centuries before social media. The Church's counter-arguments, slow and ponderous, were drowned out by the relentless clatter of Protestant presses. But the press's reach stretched far beyond theology. Scientific ideas, once confined to elite circles, now leaped between cities. Copernicus's heliocentric theory, once a fringe notion, found allies in printed star charts. Medical texts, no longer distorted by generations of scribble errors, spread life-saving knowledge. Even cookbooks and farming manuals democratized skills that had been oral traditions for centuries. The medieval world, built on layers of controlled knowledge, was unraveling stitch by stitch. Gutenberg likely never imagined his machine would topple kingdoms. He'd hoped to print prayer books, not revolutions. Yet by severing the link between authority and information, his press made the medieval order untenable. When every artisan's workshop could become a publishing house, when every merchant's daughter might read radical ideas, power could no longer hide behind Latin or parchment. The press hadn't just changed how words were made, it had changed who got to hear them, and in that shift, the modern world began to stir. From the baptism of Clovis that fused faith and power to the ink-stained fingers of Gutenberg's press, these 30 moments weren't isolated events, they were threads woven into the grand tapestry of medieval Europe. Each one tugged at the fabric of history, reshaping kingdoms, redrawing borders, and redefining what it meant to rule. The coronation of Charlemagne didn't just revive an empire, it set a template for the uneasy dance between popes and emperors. The Black Death didn't merely kill millions, it shattered feudalism's chains, giving peasants their first taste of bargaining power. And when Columbus set sail under Ferdinand and Isabella's banner, he carried with him the ambitions of a newly unified Spain, hungry for worlds beyond the Reconquista. What emerged from these centuries wasn't just a collection of kingdoms, but the DNA of modern Europe. The Magna Carta's ink stained the future of democracy, while the Hanseatic League's ledgers foreshadowed global capitalism. Joan of Arc's sword carved the idea of nationhood into French identity, and the Investiture Controversy's icy standoff at Canossa foreshadowed the separation of church and state. Even the Vikings, once Europe's nightmare, became the architects of trade networks and legal traditions that still shape our world. This tapestry is far from finished. Every castle ruin, every manuscript, every whispered legend invites us to pull another thread, to uncover the stories still hidden in the folds of time. So tell us which of these moments resonates with you. Was it Alfred's desperate stand against the Vikings, or the thunder of William's cavalry at Hastings? Share your favorites in the comments below, and if you're hungry for more tales of knights, kings, and revolutions lost to time, hit that subscribe button. The medieval world is vast, and we've only just begun to explore it together.